The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame.
Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games, games that respect your time. I am Reagan Kelly, and I'm joined by my full complement of co-hosts.
Laura Nash.
Nate Heininger.
And Shane Kelly.
And this week we are talking about brand new, I think it's safe to call this a hit game from developer Four Quarters and publisher Devolver Digital, and that is Loop Hero, which is a... we'll have to get into the description here, but it is a...
unclassifiable.
Very close to unclassifiable. Roguelite RPG idle game /
deck builder
with a lot of tabletop DNA.
Yeah, it's got a lot of all sorts of... This is a real chimera
retro
of a
graphics.
Game. Yeah.
This game is extremely hard to explain, and then when you play it, you're going to get it in about 3 minutes.
Yes, and yet...
Yes, except for
all of it.
No, you're going to get the game, but it's going to make no effort to explain itself to you. Yeah, which we'll talk about later, but that it continues to crack me up how this game tutorializes.
We're definitely going to, have our standard structure here of like trying to go through generalities, what we like and didn't like about the game, kind of talking through its systems and everything. We're probably going to have a spoiler break where we'll talk about our strategies, or we'll probably have some of that before the spoiler break, but I think we're going to save some of our like hottest strats for after the spoiler break, is my thought. And also, this game has a lot of story that it reveals in some pretty clever and interesting ways, and some of that we'll probably save for after spoiler break as well. So stick around for that if you're interested. But yeah, somebody want to take a stab first at just sort of explaining the format, the various systems at work here?
I can try. I'll start just by saying this is a game that really came fast. This was announced only last December, and it kind of went through early access, I think, right? And then now it's out with its full release, and it feels like it hit pretty fast. So
yeah, something about that I think is really interesting is like you can kind of tell that Devolver really believed in this game. Like they sent it out to streamers and everything way in advance, a little farther in advance than you usually see. They were pretty free about giving out codes to various outlets. I'll say right up front that we got advance access to this, and we would have probably been in with earlier episode on it actually if we hadn't had some technical issues. We don't really need to go into those right now, but definitely I think this was a game that like the Devolver people figured out that this had something special and were really eager to like see this find its audience, and it seems like they've been successful according to the
worth mentioning as you're talking about the Devolver connection there is this was Devolver Digital's Game of the Year, and they basically nominated it as the Game of the Year at the same time as they announced it. They said this is our 2021
really
Game of the Year. Yeah, it's very strange.
So it's already sold apparently 500,000 copies on Steam within its first week, which is, I think, a certified hit. For a game like this, which I think is a real surprisingly this is not the sort of game that I would expect to be like a big hit. But here we are.
But let's describe what
so we wanted to talk about what it is. Yeah, I derailed a little bit from that because I think that the story of how hard and fast this was. This hit and was promoted is pretty interesting, but the game itself is more interesting. This is a game where you have a hero who is going to awaken at a campfire and go in a circle around a board that is kind of a tile-based board with little pixel art tiles. And on that circular road that he starts off on, there are monsters, and there are other tiles you can place that do a variety of things. And as you fight the monsters, which you start off with a bunch of slimes, the battles play out as a totally or almost completely hands-off turn-based battle. You're not commanding the hero to do anything. The hero just, attacks, the enemies attack, and they go back and forth and whittle each other down. When you've defeated your first slime, you're going to receive one of two things that tie into I would say two of the biggest mechanical systems of the game. System one is it's going to give you tiles, and you place those tiles on the board to change the terrain on that loop. So you can add tiles onto the road itself. Many of them do things like produce monsters for your hero to fight. You can place some adjacent to the road that often will also be making monsters or providing some kind of benefit or hindrance. And the third thing is you can put tiles way off in the distance, off of the road. And those are going to have some kind of small effect as well. And basically, you are in some ways playing the role, something akin to the dungeon master of this world. It is all fantasy themed, so it's kind of apt that you'd be setting up the challenges for the hero. You basically want to produce a board that's going to give your hero monsters that are of an appropriate challenge for your hero. So that's that first way of interacting with the game, is that system of laying down the tiles, and there's many tiles. The second, I'm just going to do high level on these without trying to get too deep, because each of these systems is pretty deep. The second is the system of getting gear for your hero, and your hero has a large number of different stats. For someone you don't control at all, the only way you control the hero is by modifying their stats, and you do that by equipping them with various different pieces of gear that you also receive as loot drops when you kill these monsters. So you're leveling up the hero, and you're giving them harder monsters to fight. And you go around the loop until either you decide to quit or you are killed. And in either case, you're then going back to a town. And then on top of everything I just described, there's kind of a town building element to the game that helps you level up.
Yeah, so the loops have the roguelite structure. You are resetting every time you start a new loop, or not new loop, but every time you go out on one of these expeditions. Mm-hmm. But the town is your sort of persistent upgrades.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it does very, very minor upgrades. It'll be things like you're increasing your HP by 2%, increase attack speed by 1%, but you're doing multiple different things that slowly improve your character. So each run, you're going to be entering into the loops, a little bit stronger, or you're unlocking new cards by building out your town and being able to create new and more interesting and more challenging loops for your hero. And it's a really, really satisfying gameplay loop. I really enjoyed this game.
So I was really afraid I was going to hate this game because it felt like I like maybe 1 out of every 5 roguelikes. This game has auto combat, and thus it turned into a solitaire. I felt like I was playing a card game or a physical board game with myself. And I really loved it because all of these little mechanics are all the things I love about roguelikes and about playing D&D, but none of the the grindy combat stuff was all automated. So I was really happy with this.
It's so funny. That's a good point, Laura. It is part of what makes this game so satisfying and simple to play, but then also part of what makes it really challenging and at times frustrating, and a good frustrating, the kind of frustrating you want from a challenging game, where you're just setting up systems and you're really hoping that this goes the way that you want it to go. But there's enough randomness in the combat and enough randomness in the monster spawning and all the different things that you're basically saying I really think I'm going to succeed in these battles, and then you just watch. And you can't control, you'll get into a fight where it's your hero and 4 or 5 monsters, and you don't control who they attack first. Mm-mm. If you are a JRPG style player, you're going to really want to be get the healer, kill that guy first and then get this guy, then get this guy, but you have no control over it. So you just watch and just hope that your little hero makes the right decision and kills the things in the appropriate order, which is kind of thrilling to watch because you're just watching your little systems play, but then also it can turn on a dime so fast when you're like, I'm crushing, and then just one fight, the whole thing falls apart and you're dead.
Shane hit the nail on the head when he said that you're playing Dungeon Master, because you really are playing game designer in some ways, because you have cards you're laying down. You decide what the obstacles are, where they're putting what to layer on top of what. And I think the reason I really loved the auto combat feature is really because the whole pace of the way I played the game changed. Because to me, my favorite thing is that you are in adventure mode or you're in planning mode, and you can just hit the space bar and everything pauses and you lay your tiles out and then you hit go and it just runs. That's something that's been in a million games before, but what makes it really nifty in here is how easy it is to swap between the two. It's not automated. The game doesn't control it. Even if you're in the middle of the battle, you can hit the space bar, and at the end of the battle, you're back to pause. Like, it felt very much like in D&D when you are, saving your action until the next turn. I felt like I was just saving the planning until the battle was over and I was going to hop on it. Like, there's tons of little UX things that made this really enjoyable to play and got me way past my worries up front. I loved it.
A comparison for me on this game, when we say we're kind of playing Dungeon Master here, really I want to compare this to the game that came out on Apple Arcade maybe last year, early in the year, I think. Is called Takeshi and Hiroshi. We almost covered it for the show, but I wound up really not liking it. It actually has a very similar concept to this, and an art style that I actually like a lot more than this one, which I think the art here is a little bit bland. But in Takeshi and Hiroshi, you are an older brother who is making a video game for your younger brother, and the mechanic, like what you're actually doing, is basically the same. You're putting enemies in front of a hero that you don't control, trying to make sure that they have something that's an appropriate level for them to like kill and advance. And in that game, you are managing like your little brother's engagement with the video game you're making, which I thought was awesome. But what that game did not do is give you the systems that this game does. This game says, okay, what if we took the hero completely out of your control, which is the same thing that game was doing. But what if we gave you lots of overlapping systems that do allow you to control the experience? So you have control over what cards are in your deck. You have control over the hero's class. You have control over what equipment they're dropping, they're wearing. And the biggest thing you're controlling is how many enemies. For me, I think the biggest thing to control in this game is how many enemies are in a given encounter. Some of the heroes, like the warrior, really works well when you have lots of enemies in the encounter to fight. For example, the necromancer works much, much better when you have one or very few enemies in the encounter to fight, and you're choosing what enemies based on the spawn tiles you lay down as well. So, I think it's an interesting comparison between this and that game, which that game I really wanted to like and hated, and this game, which I kind of didn't expect to like and wound up really, really liking mechanically.
Yeah, another game style that this reminds me of that we haven't touched on yet is it's like a tower defense game, but almost the inverse. Right? Normally with a tower defense, you're placing things to like kill the endless runner that is the enemy. And in this game, you're like trying to support an endless runner. You want your knight or your hero to survive for as long as possible. And so part of that is setting out proper enemies, like Shane is saying, to provide yourself with the right gear and tiles to further support yourself. But there's also things that heal your hero or buff it in other ways. So you want to set those at the right place to support it on its endless run. And I really, really like tower defense games, and you don't see a lot of them outside of just straight up tower defense. Usually it's like, a free to play app on your iPhone or whatever. I don't feel like I see a lot of tower defense DNA in many games. I know we've talked about doing Orcs Must Die a couple times, which is a great 3D tower defense game. But this game really satisfied some of my tower defense desires in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I think it's a really clever way to handle it.
That's a good point. We've talked a little bit about the sort of various systems, and I think that'll keep coming up and we'll go into more depth. But I also wanted to make sure we didn't get too far into the episode without talking about how I think this game does an incredible job with its storytelling and lore. In a way that I also kind of wasn't expecting for a game that, like, the title Loop Hero sounds like a mid-grade app game to me. It wasn't a title that like inspired a lot of like sounded like it was going to be something that had like a deep story to me. But it actually really is in an interesting way. And we haven't talked about it at all yet. So forgive me, I'm going to just sort of set it up from the beginning. This is a game about a world that has been lost to darkness, that's sort of been erased. So you, the hero, don't really know too much about the world as it was before. You've lost your memory, and everyone else you encounter pretty much has too. But it becomes obvious that there was a lich that has destroyed the world and set it into some sort of like endless loop or like, place out of time. And all of the inhabitants of the world are sort of scattered in darkness. And there's a lot of really cool little details in terms of the world building about that. Things like, at the beginning of the game, you find a small settlement that is sort of the campfire that you set off from every time you go out on one of these expeditions around the loop. And back in that settlement that you sort of try to build up over the course of the game, there's all these people that you have little brief conversations with, and they talk about things like how, they keep trying to build buildings, but every time they look away and then look back, they've vanished. The world is not just destroyed, but in the process of being erased. And your memory of it is also in the process of being erased. But you, the hero, can, by going out on this loop and battling various little slimes and things, kind of remember it and bring it back into being. And so this process of like placing tiles that you're doing is, on one side it's like you're building something, right? But on the other side, it's you're rebuilding or remembering a world, trying to bring it back into being. The other side of that is, I think, where this game gets very cool from like a theme perspective, is that yes, you're trying to kind of like save a world that is currently being lost. But there's a lot of stuff in this game that makes you occasionally wonder, well, what was this world that we're trying to save, and was it worth saving? The very earliest example of this that I thought was like one of the coolest lines I've seen in a video game. This was like a moment that I was like, oh shit, that's what we're looking at. So, one of the cards you get very early in the game is called the Vampire Mansion. And the Vampire Mansion is literally just like a mansion tile that you place next to the road. And wherever you place it on the road, vampire enemies start spawning into every combat encounter you have that's near the Vampire Mansion. It specifically,
it adds one additional combatant, the vampire, that just makes all the combats that are already there harder.
Yeah, and that's a good thing, especially at early parts of the game, because you're trying to like level up more quickly, get better drops. You want harder combat encounters early on. So you put that down, and a lot of these cards, the first time you get one or the first time you put it down, you get a little bit of flavor dialogue or monologue from the hero. And when you place your first Vampire Mansion, the hero remembers something along the lines of, oh, yes, of course, I had forgotten. Vampires owned all of our lands, and they did, many important and beneficial things for the inhabitants. And you're like, wait, what? You came from a world where all of the landowners were vampires? Like,
totally normal.
They helped our settlements to prosper.
Yeah. Don't just drop that and then continue trudging along your loop. Like, wait, what?
Guys, landlords are workers too.
It's a real job.
I was going to say, there's some commentary in that as well. I love this idea.
I think it's a stretch, but maybe. Yeah. I have to say, since we've just gotten Reagan's absolutely glowing review of the story here, I have to say I think the story's kind of shit. It's right. Just the extension of the hero has forgotten everything trope that I already really dislike. And it's just, to me, it just feels like an excuse to have like, okay, there's, we have a gameplay loop where everything has to be reset. So, okay, let's just roll with that. That's our story.
I think that the story is fine. The writing is fun and interesting. There's a lot of
fair, but like, yeah, it's okay. I really like a lot of these little subtle details. There's things like the moment a little later in the process where you first meet your first harpy, and they have like a very different view of the world that's being destroyed / created than you do, or like all of the dialogue you have with. I'm thinking specifically. We won't get into the details here, so I don't want to spoil it. But like the dialogue that you have with like the second boss was, I thought, pretty damn good. So like, yeah, maybe it's not like, I don't know. Shane, I think it's shit is like really
that's harsh.
You're voted off the podcast on this one, in my opinion. But like, I maybe it's not like lighting the world on fire, but like the writing for this fairly basic story is really really cool, and I continually was excited to get more dialogue.
I wasn't super excited by the plot, but I was by I think that having each new type of enemy have a little bit of personality was really fun. I will say when I unlocked the rogue class, for some reason I hit some button and it advanced through it, and I was like, no, and I usually don't have that reaction to missing dialogue, but I thought if the rogue class would have been introduced with something cool. So I will say I fell somewhere between. I don't think it's a Pulitzer, and I definitely don't think it's shit. But I do think there's a lot of fun to be had by having a really knowing narrator. Like even in the beginning, they point out the inventory and they're like, "You have an inventory. You have equipment slots. You know what to do."
I want to. Like, I've talked about it already, but I want to talk about the tutorializing at some point, which is funny and almost non-existent. But Shane, you've now been completely pushed against the wall on your opinion of the story on this.
No.
What is your response?
Okay, so
he was pushed against the wall.
Look, I this is a game that I really enjoyed, but every single part of this game that I enjoyed, I also have a lot of criticism of. So just be ready. That's going to be how the podcast goes this time. I feel like this is a game that it has a lot of really interesting original ideas on the one hand, but on the other hand, like it really just leans hard into like tired tropes in other places. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about it.
For me, what I liked about it was that I often don't get to play the games with all the tropes because they have things I hate in them that just make the game no fun. So I really liked that the mechanics were so tight that I could get through. I could play a game and really love a game in a genre I don't have the patience for. Like, it's not that I don't like roguelikes, it's that I don't have the patience to be good at them. This one, I felt like I could. So we talk about games respecting your time. This game is in loops, and at the end of every loop, you have an out. I needed to record this podcast, so I decided one run was just a resource run. I didn't need to fight a boss. I did 6 or 7 loops, quit the game, kept my resources, didn't feel like I missed out or didn't have fun. Like, you can have an incomplete run, and that is fine in this game, and I really liked that.
Yeah, arguably, you should be doing runs just for resources. But I think, this, we haven't talked about it yet, but this is not a short game when it comes to total runtime if you want to beat this game. Not at all. But it does provide you short access to everything. So even this dialogue and this world building that we're talking about is doled out to you in maybe 5 or 6 lines of dialogue at a time. So even if you don't like it at all, you can completely click through it and ignore it, or you can completely engage in it if you want to. It's very short, and they spend very little time on basically everything. There's little time committed to anything other than getting you back into a loop.
Yeah, it's it has a really good. It feels really silly to be talking about like the gameplay loop of a game that's called Loop Hero, and we
call it the rhythm, and then you sound sophisticated.
Exactly,
the cadence of the game.
It has a great cadence to it. I think the thing that I mean, Laura basically touched on this. The thing that I enjoyed most about this game is that it felt every time that you jump into one of these expeditions, as the game calls them, it felt like that moment in in any other game where like you're beginning to sort of like snowball into feeling powerful. You know, you start very weak. Every time you start back to nothing, you start very weak. Most of the time, even a really good run where I like really went the distance and was like really very careful about every move I was making. The longest any of those runs ever took me was an hour. And they all had that consistent feeling of like building power and becoming more powerful continually throughout the run. It was very compelling. It like really felt good to do that sort of prep. And it is really unusual to have a game where like your main interaction with it is like trying to challenge yourself but not overdo it. It's really, I don't know. I had a lot of fun with just sort of the basic systems of this.
I'll say I made it very far into this game. I've not completed it. Again, it is not a short game as far as total time to actually complete it.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Like we've had a long-standing like roguelike exception on this show, and this is the most. This is the biggest stretch we've had for like whether this counts as well as that.
I think this is directly comparable to Hades. It's exactly the same as Hades. A single run you can do in a short amount of time, and it's fun. But if you want the full story and the full like experience and a deep run with all the systems, you need to play Hades for 20 to 30 hours. I think that's kind of similar here. You could play this game for a couple hours and really understand it and enjoy it. But I think if you want all of the systems and all of the story, this feels like a 20 plus hour game. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on your enjoyment and ability to engage with the systems, but there
are a lot of reports on it from how long to beat now. There are at least there are about 20 people who have beat the game, and the average here is 27 and a half hours. So, and that's up to 37 hours completionist. So it's in that neighborhood. It's honestly in the same neighborhood as Hades. If you were going to pick between two games, I suggest Hades.
We don't need to. You don't need to just pick them both. But Reagan, you were talking about like, that power curve and you feel more powerful. I will say I brought up how far I've made it to say that like rarely did I ever feel like really powerful in this game. This game more feels like a like survival loop than like even when I beat the second boss, I like barely beat it, and I was very, very powerful. You know how the items have levels on them, so you can get a general idea of like how powerful you are and how strong you are. And I was as strong as I've ever been in this game when I decided to take on the second boss, because you can choose, which is cool. And I still like barely made my way through to the boss and beat the boss. And in that way, it feels similar to, that's when it felt the most roguelike to me. A game like Slay the Spire or a game like FTL, where you're just like dying and struggling to the end, and beating it is more like a challenge of like persistence and resistance, and like a grueling fight, and not like your Zelda, or your Link, and you're going to fight.
Oh my god, you're gonna get so much email.
I know. I can't believe, but I'm leave it in.
Just pretend you play the mod where the dad did it for his daughter, and just pretend that like I fight with Zelda. Sure.
My problem was, in my mind, I was gonna say you're in a Zelda game, and then it just came out as yours. But anyway, you're Link, and you are going up Ganondorf, and you've been grinding and you're like, you're going to kill it with no problem. That's not this game. It's like you're going to hopefully have the perfect combination of systems and loot and everything to like survive. And that's really, really, I like that. I think that's a challenge. It's a really delicate balance to make in a game. But it also leads to like just a lot of dying. Like you have an out. You can always say, I want to leave. But who wants to do that? I don't know about you guys, but I was like constantly like, I think I can make this loop. And then no.
Yeah, I made that mistake a lot. Something I thought was kind of fun, or not fun, but like really, yes, fun. But like I thought good design about this is that at any point on a loop, at literally any point, you can decide to bail out, even without like making a complete loop. And you get to leave with, what is it, like
80%.
I think it's like
60.
60 or 60.
Yeah,
60%,
of the loot that you have. If you make it back to the campfire, you can leave at any point when you're at the campfire with 100% of your loot. So even if you haven't gotten all the way to the boss, if you die, you only keep 30% of your loot. So there's this big incentive to like try to go as far as you can, but not overextend yourself. Not try to like, because if you get into a really, really mean fight, once you're in the fight, you're in the fight. And if you die, you die. You're heading out with only 30% of what you've collected, which is a big waste because, collecting resources is a huge part of how you upgrade your town and character. So it's a real bummer when you lose that huge
classic press your luck mechanic.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. It's
which is fun.
Wonderful risk reward because, and the best part about it is you are creating the risk. Because if you sail through and you keep playing and you aren't challenging yourself sufficiently, you're going to just get whomped by the bosses because you're not strong enough. But if you are bleeding out when you enter into a giant fight, you are just going to fail miserably. So it's a really nice balance where you have to figure out, you have to guess how strong things are going to be. You have to guess what different effects layered on top of each other are going to be. That's when I compare this to like a physical tabletop board game, and that's kind of what it felt like. It felt like when you're playing like one of those Euro style games and you get 4 or 5 things layered on top and suddenly your German town is incredibly wealthy. Like that's what that felt like. Or usually with me, someone else at the table has done that, and you just can't imagine how they're making so much money while you have.
Like, wait, those 2 cards do that together? Ah, damn.
Those 2 cards do that together could have been the mantra for the second hour of me playing this game.
Yeah, let's talk about that too, because like we don't need. Maybe we save some of our like hottest, most spoilery strategies for after the spoiler break. But something that's really interesting about this game is that like it has a lot of card synergies and other little mechanics that are not explained. And that's very deliberate. This game is about...
This is something I have a lot to say about.
Yes. Okay. So this is a game that like... So from a theme perspective, this is very much a game about like a forgotten world, rediscovering things as you go. And I think thematically tied into that is the mechanical side of that, which is that there are a lot of basically unexplained mechanics that are there for you to discover for yourself. And so one very prominent example of that is the card synergies or the tile synergies, where many of so a lot of the cards that you get are you're placing them as like land tiles on the board. So that might be things like a forest, which spawns rat wolves. When you pass through it, you have to fight the rat wolves. Or it might be something like a battlefield, and when you place the battlefield near the road, it causes a new chest to spawn on the road every day, so that when you come back through that area, you can collect whatever's in that chest. But one example of this would be like if you put a town, which is a tile that heals you when you pass through it.
A village.
Right, village, excuse me. You put that village on the road, but then you put a vampire mansion near it, like near enough that it's within its area of control. Well, then that village turns into I think it's called a ransacked village. And the ransacked village is basically a village that's been overrun by ghouls. And so when you go through it, rather than it healing you, you fight a bunch of ghouls, which are like slightly OP enemies depending on what point in your game you're at.
And a vampire.
Yeah, and a vampire because there's a vamp. Yeah, so it's a big fight. You're going to have like 4 or 5 enemies to fight every time you pass through it. But if you do that and you fight your way through that for 3 loops, then on the 4th loop it turns from a ransacked village into the Count's Lands, a special village tile that gives you extra healing, heals you for quite a lot of points when you pass through it. And there's a lot of little like things like that, and sometimes they're hinted at. So, for example, when you turn one of these, when you put the vampire mansion next to the town, you don't necessarily know what that's going to do, but what that means then once it turns into a ransacked village, you can mouse over it, and you do get some text that explains what the ransacked village is, so you don't have to just bumble your way in. And it says, turns into something useful after 3 turns or three loops. So something is going to happen, but you don't really know what. And you didn't know anything was going to happen until you happened to put those 2 cards next to each other. And the same goes for other things. So, for example, you put 2 of those battlefields next to each other, and you get, I forget what it's called, like the blood fields or something like that.
Blood clots.
Yeah, well, the blood clots are the enemies that spawn out of it.
Blood
right?
path.
Yeah, blood path. Thank you. And so the blood path spawns blood clot enemies, which are like extra powerful, weird enemies. There's a lot of little stuff like that. Or even something very simple, like putting meadows on the board. If you place them next to something else, they turn into blooming meadows, which have a more positive effect than the regular meadows.
Yeah, I felt so stupid how long that took me to figure out. I was like, why do some of these bloom and why do some of them not? And it's like,
meadows
you put
next to meadows don't count.
Yeah, you put
next to not meadows count.
Anything, literally anything. I really liked this element of figuring out these tile combinations, and I liked that it didn't tell you any of them. It felt kind of like recipe discovery in other games. You're like, oh, what happens if I combine this and this? What am I going to get? Most of the time, nothing. But when it does click and something cool happens, you're like, hell yeah. And I also love it's another system of risk reward, like the one you talk about, the vampire village combination. That if you can survive that extra challenging fight for 4 turns or whatever, it's going to be worth it. But even your best runs don't normally last more than 7 or 8 loops. So if you're already at loop 3 or 4 and it's starting to get really challenging, you have to decide, like, is it worth it to upgrade this village to make this a really hard fight for my last run to have this upgraded village, or should I just scrap it and not do it, even though it is a better eventual outcome? And I like that, constant addition of these little risk rewards. But overall, the tile system and the mystery around it, I really enjoyed. And I'm sure there are a ton I haven't figured out.
I don't have a huge amount of... I set myself up by saying I had a lot of complaints. This is probably the piece of the game that I have the fewest complaints about, but I do want to kind of set some kind of... to point out the juxtaposition here, because the 2 systems that you're dealing with when you're on the loop, which is the gear and the tiles skew really far in the direction of not explaining themselves at all. Which is usually something I dislike in, especially in board games, things like that, where here it's fun because you're kind of interacting with it. It's a video game, so you can experiment, you can place the tiles different places, and that is part of you growing to understand the game, is just figuring out the tile synergies. Some of the tile synergies are really obscure. I did a little online research, and there are a few of them that I would absolutely never have found on my own. And I think that is kind of cool to have something that's really unique like that. But one thing I will say is a lot of the tile synergies don't do that much. Some of them are explicitly hindrances. Like you mentioned, the blood path. I have a hard time thinking of times where you really would want to generate the blood path. There's other things like the time crystal that is very hard to use appropriately. The time crystal is something that takes any adjacent tile within the kind of 3x3 kind of 9 grid around it. And if that tile has a daily action that it does, like it spawns an enemy every day, it's going to make that happen twice per day. It's a pretty subtle effect. There are some very powerful ways to use it, but it's actually like it's very, very tricky to get effective use.
And you only have so many limited spots. I ended up turning off that card and not really using it. And just to point out, Shane, thank you for translating, but it's called the Chrono Crystal. Okay, remember we are
Chrono Crystal.
We are dealing in a fantasy world here.
I took that out of my deck and I did not put it back in because I did not know how to use it.
In order to use it effectively, I think you asked me about it, and so the effective way to use it, in my opinion, is to you can, if you position it just right, you can get, I think, about 4 blooming meadows around it. But in order to, and then each blooming meadow gives you like 3 HP per day, and then you get off of the crystal another 3. So you get if you're able to tile that out, you're able to get. But even if you're doing it in the most effective way possible, it still doesn't give you that much HP. Frankly, you put a lot of specific effort into doing things like blooming meadows and time crystals and placing all the stuff that's off of the loop, especially, is like this. Deserts, rocks, all of that stuff that you're placing, especially off the loop, is so incremental and so tiny that it feels like time filler while I wait for other things to happen in the game.
So yes and no. There's definitely places where this stuff really comes into play. Like for me, the time crystals, I agree. Like I started by using them like you were with with the blooming meadows, and that felt like a little bit like a meh. It's a bit of a nothing. But like later on, when I started, I unlocked the ruins card, which spawns those like fireworms or whatever they're called. And those enemies in particular drop really good loot, but they only spawn 1 per day. And that means that you're very often only fighting 1 or 2 of them, depending on how the timing on your loop works. But by carefully using those chrono crystals, I could set it up to reliably fight 4 of them every time I pass through their square. And I could do that using the chrono crystals within the first 2 or 3 turns, which meant that every time I passed through those areas, I was fighting like full complements of those flame dudes. And it was pretty easy because it was still fairly early in the loop, but they were dropping huge loot. So it's stuff like that. Like you have to find these like specific times where it makes sense to use them. Like and given that, like I'm not dropping those chrono crystals from my deck, at least not right now, because that is a really good early game strat. At least for me.
Same goes for the spider enemy, which is a really, really good enemy you get from the start of the game, and that you can put a spider spawner. Because it's off the road, it can give you more enemies into a fight. So we'll talk more about like strategy like that later. But basically, like I was saying, like there are these ways you can use it, but it's very incremental, very minor. Whereas some of them feel like really impactful, like maybe the Vampire Mansion. So
yeah, there's I like the spider card because I didn't have it on for a long time, but I turned it back on because I needed to generate a lot of enemies who had souls, because I had a trait later that helped me every time you kill something that has a soul.
I loved that. That was one of each
fun little.
Yeah. Oh, I found that early in the game. I rolled over and it was like living has a soul. Like they'll tell you about these characters, and it's interesting because those are not normal.
Stat
usually
blocks.
Stats are like undead.
Yeah.
But has a soul was a very specific phrasing. So I'm glad to know that comes in.
Yeah.
Slimes do not have a soul.
There are a lot of
skeletons.
Skeletons
have
that.
a soul.
Yeah. Some of these tags get applied in ways that seem a little nonsensical. So like you said, like undead stuff is listed as having a soul. Okay, I guess it does. Spiders though? For real? And so some of those tags and attributes are written in they feel like they're applied kind of hodgepodge. It seems like it's been like maybe for gameplay tweaking reasons, like maybe they wanted to up the number of enemies that triggered some particular ability. So, okay, suddenly in this world, spiders have souls, which, like, again, this goes back to how I feel like the game is like gameplay first, story second. Like they didn't write this game and say, okay, in our world, spiders have souls and vampires are in charge of villages. I feel like they came at it gameplay first, which is fine to do, I think. But it's not selling me on the great writing.
Shane, do you believe all dogs go to heaven?
Well, I don't know. Do Rotwolves have souls? If so, I suppose they go to heaven. Yeah. So I was trying to compare and contrast the two systems of the tiles, which I feel are very incremental, except for the ones that are directly on your path, and are very loosely explained in terms of, like, they might tell you, okay, this produces Rotwolves, but is a Rotwolf stronger than a spider? Do I care that it has a soul? Etc. Right? So it's very, very loosely explained. You really have to experiment. The equipment, which is dropped in the same way by killing enemies, is very, very over elaborately explained. There are so many stats in this game. It's honestly ridiculous. And many of the stats themselves are poorly explained. So, you have to learn, for example, that magic damage and magic HP, what is the function of those? I couldn't find it explained anywhere in the game. I had to dig around on the internet.
It doesn't.
So, and that is your main way of interacting with the hero, which is the main thing you're doing in the game is leveling up the hero. So, leveling up and optimizing the hero isn't terribly well supported, in my opinion. Like you have these tools at your disposal, these pieces of equipment, and many of them are simply relying on the idea that you probably have played video games before and have some built-in understanding of what evasion means, right? But what does it really mean here? The answer might surprise you. So
okay, yes, and I think like there's a real like supportable theme reason for not telling you what most of the stats mean. Like some of them you can puzzle out. Evasion, it's like, it tells you when the person has evaded something. You see a little evasion animation that says evaded. You kind of figure what that is. Some of the more mysterious ones, like magic damage, like, yes, it's very hard to figure out just by watching the game play out what magic damage actually does. But like, there's a lot of things like that in this game that go largely unexplained. And that feels like a natural part of a game about a world where everything has been forgotten and nothing is clear. Like there's a lot you don't know in this game, and magic damage or how it works when attached to your weapons is like just one of those things, and it felt like part of it to me.
To me, I didn't attribute it to theme. I attributed it to I rarely play combat-based video games, especially any shooter where there aren't a billion stats that are completely incomprehensible to me without picking up a gun manual. So I just assumed that like this was like I can guess, vampirism I assume is going to take from like a lot of it's just intuiting from other games.
Yeah.
But I also assumed there were detailed roguelite stats that I, as not a genre player, was not part of, or maybe it was from an RPG, or maybe it was from something else I haven't played. Like, I just assumed this was hidden knowledge that they assumed you had, and it didn't hurt me too badly to guess at what it was. So,
yes,
I didn't even think until you said it that it could have anything to do with the theme. I just assumed it was like, oh, don't you, kind of like how Blaseball assumed everyone knew how to play baseball until they found out they didn't.
Yeah,
I think this is more along the lines of like how Blaseball has stats like unthwackability, and like what is unthwackability? It doesn't matter, but that's cool. Like
you can't be thwacked.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think it's more like the story. I think this is more to like what Shane is saying, as far as like the story covering for some of the gameplay decisions. Because ultimately, I think this is because the way you actually interface with the equipment is so rapid fire, and the way the game tells you what's better is completely different. So every item has an item level. So every time you get like a sword, it'll have like a little 1 or 2 or 3, as you go up the level. And then there's also colors of rarity. classic RPG, you know, blue is rare, and then like yellow is more rare, and orange is the most rare, right? So if you have a level 4 sword that is orange, regardless of what its individual stats are, because some of these items will have like 4 different stats on them, it's going to be better than that level 2 blue item that you got maybe 3 minutes ago. So you're probably going to swap it out anyway. So if you're really spending a lot of time, like really trying to min-max these stats, you replace your equipment so fast that I think you're probably going to either drive yourself crazy or waste a lot of time really trying to min-max when there's so much coming your way and it happens so fast that it's not really worth it. So like, I think that's really what the game is going for. Like, yeah, my favorite character is Necromancer, and I still don't really know what the difference between summon quality and skeleton level is. But I know when I get this new ring that gives me a slightly better summon quality than the previous ring, I'm just going to take that new one. Or if I have to, but even if that wasn't the best decision, it's going to be replaced maybe within like 30 seconds from something better anyway.
It really does. In this game, like the way that you're playing, what you are doing is optimizing the hero. Some of the stats are more valuable than others. So for your Necromancer specifically, like I also could not figure out the difference between skeleton quality and skeleton level, and I didn't have time to Google it. But you know what's really important to the Necromancer? Probably attack speed, because when you attack, it's when you summon a skeleton. So if you're building by applying the equipment and you're really trying to prioritize a particular skill like attack speed, there are going to be times where you're getting much higher level, much higher rarity gear. And by the way, the rarity of the gear doesn't tell you, I don't think, anything about the quality of the stat boost that you're getting. It's just that each level of rarity means that piece of equipment buffs one additional stat. So the highest rarity buffs 4 stats. The lowest rarity, the gray ones, buffs only 1 stat. And in fact, there are many, many situations where if you're trying to make a character that's optimized to do a specific thing, you're going to be choosing lower rarity gear that does the one specific thing. In fact, if you have 2 level 5 pieces of gear and you care about optimizing for a particular stat, you're going to always choose the lower rarity one, because the higher rarity one spreads the buff around amongst 4 different stats, whereas the lower rarity but one buffs only 1 stat. So like I said, this is a system that I feel has a lot of things pulling in a lot of different directions. And I could see maybe someone really liking engaging with this system. And I found it okay.
I really did like engaging with this system. Something that I felt like it encouraged for me was that I like the example of like skeleton quality versus skeleton level. I did a couple of different runs where one I prioritized one and the other I prioritized the other. And by doing that, it became really obvious what the actual meaning was. I don't know if I want to spoil that for folks here, but if you didn't know, I discovered through doing that skeleton quality meant that you more often summoned those more advanced skeletons, the skeleton warrior or the like big lumbering skeleton heavy or whatever, the one with the club, versus the standard skeletons, versus skeleton level just being basically like what is the like, you know, HP and damage level of the skeleton. And it's like that. It's not obvious from the name, although it's a stat that makes sense, and it makes sense to have as separate stats. And it kind of encouraged trying different builds.
Does it though? Because what's the point of a bigger, bulkier skeleton if its HP and damage are based on a different stat entirely?
Well, it attacks more slowly. It draws attacks. It attacks more slowly, but with bigger, heavier hits. And then the warrior is sort of its opposite. The warrior is attacking more frequently. I think it's more of a kind of, I don't know. I think it's more of a glass cannon. Hey, it also looks different and is cooler. So I think it was interesting to play around with those stats. So I get it that maybe, it could have been simpler, but I thought it was pretty cool. And
I enjoyed the rapid fire nature of it. I like how quickly you're swapping out things. just one last thing about the tutorialization. There's a whole system that I don't think we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about. Building out your town, creating supply slots and resources, and there's an entire crafting element to this game that it tells
what
you.
What an annoying addition.
It tells you nothing about, and there are rare items that you can find, like tables and garlic and, a cool mirror that add permanent bonuses. It's similar to like a relic from Slay the Spire. One individual one, probably not super strong, but once you have 5, 6, 7 of these, it's going to really make your character strong.
Once you have a table and all of the chairs.
Exactly.
I mean, then
but it doesn't even tell you.
Together.
That's the high fantasy element that we all crave, right? Is collecting furniture.
Hey, you're talking to someone whose like exclusive use of The Sims was finding free mods on the internet to build better houses.
Yeah. Any fan of Beauty and the Beast is going to want a nice chair, a nice table. Anyway, it tells you, it doesn't even tell you like how to put, like that you have to put these things into supply slots, that you have limited supply slots. Like, no, I did multiple runs before I was like collecting these items, like cool. And I realized like it doesn't seem to be doing anything. So then I had to build a thing and put them into a select amount of spots. And once I figured it out, it all makes sense. It's pretty standard, video game stuff, and that this game is heavily relying on you knowing standard video game things. But I just thought it was so funny. There's nothing that is like, hey, here's your supply depot. Here's where you put your items. Put your items there to make sure they work. Nothing. And I just, it's funny. It became laughable to me how little this game bothers to tell you how to play it. And
I didn't know that when you
did figure it out though, right?
Cars?
Like that's something that's cool about this. Is like it's I think it's cool that this game is like, here's a bunch of systems, figure it out.
Intentional.
When you get your cards all the way full and they drop off, like I thought that you weren't going to draw any more cards. It's like, oh, those turn into resources. I should have known that earlier. Cool.
Yeah. It's definitely a choice. And it just, I've not seen a game with this degree of systems make such little effort to tell you how to interact with the game, which I think is interesting. And I assume that I think I got most of them, but there's probably a bunch of stuff I've left behind.
One thing that I will say, like that in counterpoint to that is that the game has mouse over text on almost everything. So if you do like hover your mouse over and well, that's true. But those are text in and of themselves. Yeah. So if you are like wondering like, hey, what does this building do? Or if you open up the building interface and you hover over something within that building's little interface, it'll tell you something. It may not tell you exactly what you need to know, but it'll tell you something to give you an idea of like what's up with that. And I found that whole aspect of this, the discovery aspect, to be really rewarding. Like I get that being weird or frustrating or maybe even like disqualifying for some people if that's really something you hate, but I thought that was super cool. I really enjoy that about it.
I never found it frustrating. I just was like, what? Like this whole thing exists over here? Or when you go to craft something, you're spending resources to craft stuff, and some of these resources are very valuable. And you're like, what am I even? There's just little icons that you have to try to figure out to determine what you're going to craft. And you're like, well, I hope this is worth these resources. Cool, I made more garlic. Is that all I make is garlic? Every time I click this button, I've made garlic so far. I don't know if that's all I make when I click that button, but it sure seems that way.
Yeah.
So it's to me that my last thought on this is that it seemed like the opposite feeling of what I think of a really good puzzle game. It's a game where you're like, I am a genius. No one else can figure this out. Yeah. And in this game, it constantly was me playing and being like, oh man, I think I'm getting really good at this game. And then I would find out something and I'd be like, oh, I was secretly an idiot those other 8 chances because I didn't know this. Next time I'm going to be a genius. So I never felt stupid during the game, but I, in retrospect, was like, what a fool. If I had only known that, that blooming meadow was had to be replaced by a rock.
I really like like subset games does it where they have complicated systems and they tell you how every system works, just not what to do with them or how, like, what's good or bad about them. But they're like, this does this. If you click this, it'll do this. And I appreciate that balance. Like, tell me what is available and then let me figure it out. This game is like, we're not even going to tell you what there is to do, how to do it, how to unlock it. Just get in there and figure it out.
Which is what the children feel about Minecraft.
This is children understand Minecraft naturally and natively now. It's how I feel about Fortnite. So I think it's probably a good time for us to head to our spoiler break. And after the spoiler break, it's just going to be us briefly talking about our hot strats. So if you want to stick around for that,
strats.
Yeah,
you can put an echo on that in when you edit this. Can you just put an echo on me when I say
strats?
So before we go to spoiler break, this is The Short Game. Thank you for listening. You can find the show on the internet at www.theshortgame.net, where you'll find our contact form. That's a good way to let us know what you think about the show or suggest games. Or you can find us on Patreon. That's where we'd really love for you to find us. Patreon.com/theshortgame, where you can, if you support us at even $1 a month, you get instant access to our Discord. That's where we chat about the games that we're playing. We chat about what we're planning for the show. It's a great place if you want to suggest a game to us in a longer form way where we can ask you questions about it. That's a great way to get in touch with us there. So join us on patreon.com/theshortgame. Thank you very much there. And of course, you can find our show on Twitter at _shortgame, or you can find me on Twitter at RayganK. That's RayGanK. Shane, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at 8bitshane.
And Nate, where can people find you?
On Twitter at NateSTL.
And Laura, where can people find you?
On Twitter at Laura J. Nash.
And thanks, listeners, for joining us if you're dropping off here. And if not, join us on the other side of the spoiler break for some hot strats.
Strats.
Hot strats. What you got?
My first hot strat for you is... and this is like everything in this, I'm going to say something that's good about the game, but it's also a veiled complaint. So the biggest thing that you're doing in the game, the thing that has the most impact on your game, is choosing which tiles are in your deck and then placing those tiles, which many people have compared this to a deck building game, which I do not really think it qualifies entirely as a deck building game, because you're not choosing how many of the cards are going in your deck. And anyway, I'm going to try and... But we're talking about strats. So when you do pick, the number one most valuable card to have in your deck is called the Bookery. In any kind of game where you have a deck of cards that are being dealt out to you randomly, like they are here, a lot of those cards are going to be situational. So like a big example of that in this game is the maybe what do they call it? The wheat field. The wheat field can only be placed next to a town. So if you get a wheat field but you don't get a town card, or you haven't already placed a town, it's useless to you. What happens in this game? Well, you have a hand size of 13 cards, and if your hand fills up and you have more than 13 cards, then every time you draw a card, you're also discarding a card, which generates a resource that I think is called like
lore,
spooky memory goo or something like that.
Sure.
So it's just one more of the resource. Which, by the way, the resources I never really engaged at it at the level of like trying to optimize for particular resources. I suppose you can. Anyway, the Bookery. The Bookery is it's a tile that when you walk past it. It has actually 4 placements are kind of around the edge of it. It goes next to the road. And so you can, if you position it in kind of a corner, you can have it trigger maybe even 3 times. But the Bookery takes the last 3 cards in your hand and discards them and draws new cards. So lots of these cards are going to be things that you want sometimes, but not other times. Like maybe those spider spawners, you want those early in the game. You don't want them later in the game. Maybe the wheat fields, you have a use for them now, you don't have a use for them later. And in a lot of cases, you want things that affect the board in different ways at different parts of the game. So the bookery will let you cycle through and see more of your deck. So this is really, really valuable. It basically makes every other card in the deck better. So that's my pick for the number one most valuable card.
Awesome. I think as far as like hot strats, I don't know if I have anything that's like quite on the level of like, like do this, but I am going to say that once I unlocked the Necromancer, the game started feeling a lot easier to me. I'm not sure if the Necromancer just worked better for me or if the Necromancer is like legitimately easier to play than the other classes. But the Necromancer so the way the Necromancer class works, basically, instead of attacking, you summon skeletons. Every single time you go into combat, you start with a certain amount of magic HP. That's sort of like a magical shield or mage armor kind of thing. And so you have to take a sometimes quite significant amount of damage before you start taking actual damage in any given combat. And you can start spawning those skeletons immediately who do all the damage for you. The big strat with the Necromancer, as far as I'm concerned, is to go hard on the +1 skeleton upgrades. They're pretty rare. You can usually find a ring that has just +1 skeleton, maximum number of skeletons summoned, and no other upgrades. And even that is usually worth taking or replacing even a pretty good ring is like +1 to your total number of skeletons is almost always worth it as long as you're not replacing like your last piece of equipment. And if you are looking, occasionally you'll get really good items that are like, a level 5 tome or whatever that has +1 extra skeleton and a whole set of other more standard upgrades. And that is always the thing to keep. And in many cases, it's worth keeping those even if that item is significantly underleveled for you compared to the rest of the run, because that +1 skeleton upgrade never scales. You might have a ring that has +1 skeleton on it, that's like a level 2 ring, and then like later into the game you might get like a +1 skeleton ring that's like level 6. Those two rings are identical. Like that upgrade, I've never seen anything that says, well, okay, now you get +2 skeletons from this one piece of equipment. It's only ever one. And so it's usually worth keeping those items, even if you find something that's significantly over leveled, because that upgrade is like so meaningful when you're playing as a Necromancer.
So Reagan, my favorite class so far is also Necromancer. I think it's just a little bit more interesting than the other two. And I have had my most success with it. So I don't know, maybe it is easier, but I've been really enjoying it. A couple strategies that I landed on that were pretty effective early on, but they've become less effective as the game's gotten more challenging, but I still think it's worth sharing, is when you're placing you're choosing where the combat is. So one thing I like to do is try to prioritize regen per second, so like health regeneration per second, as much as I can, and basically create like pockets of combat and spaces in between that will basically allow, if you're getting as much regeneration as possible, you enter into combat maybe 2, 3, 4 tiles in a row, and then leave a long path for your hero to go along as unattacked as possible. You can't completely control it because of slimes, but give yourself as much space to regen. Maybe let a day click over so all your meadows click over, and then enter into another sort of combat area. And I couple that with a card that I really like, which is called the Blood Grove, which you can only place next to a grove, and every tile within its range, if you get an enemy below 15%, they automatically die. So especially with these fights where you're fighting 2, 3, 4, 5 things, being able to slice off 15% of their total HP adds up quickly. So I'd like to make these little pockets where every enemy, or as many of them as I can, are all within the grasp of a Blood Grove. And then everywhere else is either empty or full of villages, which heal you when you go through them. And then especially for the first boss and to a lesser degree, the second boss, you know you're making the decision to fight the boss, and you always fight the boss at the campsite. So one thing I'd like to do is put 2 or 3 of my villages right up to the campsite. So you are going to enter into the campfire at as close to full health as possible.
Yeah, speaking of that boss, you trigger the boss specifically by filling up a meter that fills up when you place tiles. So you really do get to choose when you fight the boss. A good way to rush to the end with the boss is with the treasury, because it pays you off with tiles for placing tiles. So
I like the treasury a lot. Quickly. And you can stack treasuries next to each other, sort of like a chapel in Carcassonne, where one tile hits both of the treasuries, and it's very satisfying because you just stack resources and cards.
We talked about the 2 different kinds of we talked about 2 of the 3 different classes, and I want to tell you about what I think about some of this play style behind those classes. The difference between the classes is pretty stark, especially between the warrior and the necromancer. But the warrior is really based around just heavy hitting, but also you can build up a stat that says like damage to all. Mm-hmm. So the warrior really rewards you for having maybe a smaller number of fights, but dealing with a large number of enemies in those fights. So something that's really great for the warrior is to buff your damage to all, and then to do the kind of, what is it, the vampire town, the ransacked village, where you have have 5 enemies, or to do the spiders and to put a chrono crystal on there so you get lots of spiders. So that's the thing to know about that is you of course you're getting cards and gear from these enemies. But let's say you have one really high level enemy and a bunch of really low level enemies, like maybe spiders plus the vampire. All of those enemies are going to drop loot based on the quality of the encounter, not the quality of the individual enemy. So that's actually very beneficial. I think the best thing I was able to set up was to routinely have a fight that was 1 vampire, 1 chest from the battlefield, which plays like it is an enemy, but actually doesn't attack you, except maybe once in a while when it's a mimic, and then a bunch of spiders. So that's a very, very high reward encounter without a lot of risk, and I was able to set up a lot with those. But comparing that to the necromancer, where the necromancer, it's a snowballing based class, where what you want to do is have a lot of skeletons hitting. What can really wreck you is a large number of enemies in the encounter. So if you were to do the ransacked town, I almost never survived the ransacked town with the necromancer. I had to be very, very careful about when I did that. Because in that, if you have 5 things hitting your skeletons and you're not able to keep skeletons alive, you will die. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an interesting back and forth on the playstyle there. I never really got the hang of the thief, which is more about like critical hits. So I think that's a much more like equipment based class. They play around a lot more with
you get 2 weapons,
specific stats.
Yeah, the best I could tell with that class is you really want to go on as much as you can on evade and really just like damage avoidance, because they don't have a lot of health. They don't have a lot of stuff to get health back. You're really just trying to kill as quickly and as fast as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. I had a few pretty good runs with it, but ultimately I found myself having the least amount of deep runs with that class, and especially for the show when I'm like I was really trying to beat the game before we recorded, but was not able to. I was like, I can see the value in this one, but this feels really difficult. Whereas Necromancer or Warrior just felt more manageable. I did want to say really quickly, too, my first 2 chests I got in this game were both mimics. Oh. I was like, this can't be these have to be good, right? These have to be worthwhile. There's no reason why you would put this down. And then I didn't have a mimic for like 15 chests after that. So like crazy random number generator for my first 2 to be mimics.
Yeah,
that's funny.
That sucks. Well, I don't know. Does anybody have any last thoughts in terms of recommended approaches or early game strats or anything like that?
Just, I said it earlier in the show, but I think it's okay and worthwhile for you to do runs where you're like, I'm going to go and do 5 loops and get out with resources to build up your town. Because some of the permanent upgrades that you can get from the town, things like resurrections, potions, these things that extend your life have, repeated lasting benefit. And if you're going in every run, like, I'm going to kill the boss, then you're just going to probably end up losing a lot of resources. So especially when you get through a boss, you're probably not going to be able to kill the next boss without committing to multiple town upgrades. So be okay with making dedicated resource runs.
Yeah, and also that you can go back to the previous chapters. So if, running a brand new chapter just to farm for some resources seems daunting and you want some slightly more mindless or faster playing version of that, you can go back, let's say you're on chapter 3, you can go back to chapter 2 or even chapter 1 and just run for resources for a while. And the resources that you're drawing from, as far as I could tell, are the same. I don't think that you're gaining new resources in the later chapters that you won't get if you're playing the previous ones. So I was just generally going back to I was mostly, I was on chapter 3 and I was mostly just going back to chapter 2 to kind of grind for some stuff. And then going in and upgrading my town and back and forth. And that was a good way to spend some time. It was pretty chill and not super involved, but that's part of the design of this game. It's got a little bit of that sort of idle game mentality to it. Good podcast material. If you listen to something like the short game while you're playing it. And then, when you go into you'll know if you're in a run where okay, this is the run. I'm going for the end. I'm going to try to summon the lich or whatever. You'll know, then you can pause the podcast.
Yeah, I definitely, we didn't even talk about the music. The music's fine, but this is a game that I very quickly started engaging with other things while playing. And I thought that was great.
Yeah, that's a valuable thing for me sometimes. Like, I like to have a game that I can listen to a podcast or an audiobook and still have something fun to do with my hands and the part of my brain that isn't listening.
That's part of why I still play Slay the Spire so much. It's my idle, or it's my do 3 things at the same time game. Look at the big screen on my TV, look at the small screen on my Switch, and peek at the even smaller screen on my phone, because I am a monster and addicted to everything.
I think this would be a really good game on iOS, by the way. I would love to play this more on an iPad. I actually did play this on iPad for a significant amount of the time. I was streaming it from my PC to my iPad and playing with the Apple Pencil. And they do that is totally doable. I did miss having a right click. Because this game really makes use of the right click I was making a lot of use of the right click to switch between the modes, and also not really being able to do the mouse overs was a little annoying, because there were a lot of times where I needed to see mouse over text, and I would have to pick something up and do a quick drag and then let it go in order to get mouse over text from it. But they could easily do some little UI refinements and make this work extremely well on iPad, and I think this would be a great game for that platform. I think they'd have to do more work in order to make it work well on something like the Switch, where I think most people are going to be playing with gamepad controls, and this game doesn't feel well suited to that at the moment. But this is a mouse and keyboard game as far as I'm concerned right now.
Definitely.
Play it that way. It's a good one to play on your laptop or whatever.
I have just one more strat before we wrap, and that is the Oblivion card and knowing how and when to use it. Okay. It seems like a super powerful card because it lets you, blast a tile and remove everything on that tile from the game, and it is pretty powerful for that. But that's a little, once you start placing the tiles very specifically where you want them, that the utility there really starts to fall off. So like if you're, you really don't want that blood path, you can delete the blood path. Or if you are, we didn't even talk about the mountain, and you can place, for every 10 rocks you place, it spawns a goblin camp. And you might have a goblin camp in a spot you don't want one, so the Oblivion card is good for that. But it's also, it's very good if you think, oh, I just barely need a little bit more. I'll die if I get another fight, but I can maybe blast one fight and make it back to home and maybe bail. But the thing I wound up using the Oblivion card for the most is kind of silly and doesn't feel like maybe the intended use. When you put a 9-tile grid of rocks and mountains together, they form a gigantic mountain, and you get a big pile of loot out of that. You get a bunch of resources. You also get a big HP buff. Well, if you then blow up one of those 9 tiles, they go back to being 9 rocks. And then you can place another rock and get the same bonus over again. So if you just alternate between rock and Oblivion, you can really buff yourself and get a ton of resources by just demolishing and rebuilding the mountain.
Huh.
Yeah, I tried that. I didn't feel like I got the HP boost, but you do definitely, the resources is nice.
Well, you get the HP boost by placing the rocks themselves. Now, the mountain gives you, the mountain is what gives you the resources. The rocks themselves, the individual rocks, are what gives you the HP.
Yeah, I did that based off of your recommendation from the Discord, and then I use it. I always kept one to blow up goblin camps, because goblin camps, they spawn a lot of goblins, and the reward, they don't drop much in terms of rewards. So it ends up being just a HP drain fight that I try to avoid as much as possible.
They're also, if I could say one more thing about goblins.
You can always say one more thing about goblins.
They're really annoying because they synergize with each other. So I mentioned the play style for the warrior. So the necromancer goblins are really crappy because they appear in large numbers, and anything with large numbers is bad for the necromancer. But for the warrior, you actually do want large fights. So you'd think you want the goblins, but what you really want is large fights of enemies that don't synergize or work well together. So that's why like the spiders plus the vampire works when like maybe vampire plus zombies doesn't work that well, isn't quite as is a little harder. There are a lot of little synergies between the different kinds of enemies. Goblins have really tight synergies. There's like a goblin boss and a goblin recruit, and when either of them, and like they buff each other, and when they die they buff each other. So goblins in a crowd are specifically really annoying to fight. So yeah, definitely try and get rid of those goblins, or have the goblins be dropped into a place where you already have a different enemy type, because there's a cap on the number of enemies in a fight. And so if you have the goblins going into a fight that already has maybe skeletons and spiders in it, they're not going to be enough to synergize with each other.
Totally. Well, I guess that's it for us for now. If you, listener, have been playing a little bit of Loop Hero and you have strategies that you think are worth sharing, we would love to hear them, because we're all, I think, still working on completing the game, and I'm definitely planning to continue with it, and we'll be talking about it on our Discord. So join us there. Patreon.com/theshortgame will get you in, and we would be happy to chat with you about your strategies or your takes on the lore or world of the game, whether you think the writing is good or lame, as Shane seems to. So come join us and talk about it there. And thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Short Game, and we'll see you back here next week.
Thanks, everyone.